Hey guys, tonight we're curling up somewhere a little different. You're not in your bed anymore. Instead, imagine yourself stepping into a small stone chamber lit by a single candle. The flame flickers against uneven walls, casting long shadows that stretch across bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling. Beneath your bare feet, the floor crunches softly. It's covered in rushes, a mix of straw, dry grass, and fragrant plants meant to absorb everything. You pull a heavy woolen blanket around your shoulders and notice the bed isn't quite a bed. It's more like a wooden frame strung with ropes, sagging in the middle. A lumpy mattress stuffed with straw or feathers sits atop, and yes, there's a definite barnyard smell. This is medieval bedtime. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere cozy, tell me where you are and what time it is. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine travels. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie back in your lumpy straw mattress. The room is quiet, mostly. You can hear a faint whistling draft through the shuttered window. Candles gutter low. The flame dances briefly before thinning to a tiny, persistent point. The scent of beeswax and smoked meat lingers in the air. Somewhere off to your left, someone's already snoring. Loudly. It could be a sibling, a servant, maybe even a goat. People shared their sleeping quarters with all sorts of companions. And the bed itself, if you're lucky enough to have one, it's considered a prized possession. It might even be passed down like a family heirloom. A noble's bed frame could be as elaborately carved as a cathedral door, draped in thick curtains to hold in warmth and privacy. For peasants, it's more humble, just wood, rope, and bedding made from whatever's available. Sometimes that means wool, sometimes old grain sacks, sometimes moss, if you're really unlucky. You tug your blanket tighter. You'll need it. There's no central heating here. Even in summer, the nights can get cold in thick-walled stone houses or thatch-roofed cottages. And let's not even talk about the winters. You'd better hope someone remembered to throw another log on the fire before turning in, or else you're going to dream about frostbite. Now, picture the light dimming even more. The candle's down to a stub. Most households go to bed shortly after sunset, not because they're super into wellness routines, but because candles and lamp oil are expensive. Once the sun goes down, you either sleep or you squint in the dark trying to find the privy without stepping on a chicken. And speaking of chickens, the night doesn't belong entirely to humans. Out in the courtyard or fields, owls hoot. A fox might skulk by, nose to the wind. Dogs bark at shadows. If you're in a town, you might hear a distant shout of fire from the night watch, or the hollow clop of hooves on cobblestone as someone rides through after curfew. But most of the noise, the lullabies and disruptions alike, will come from the bodies in your room. You're not alone. Very few people in the Middle Ages slept solo. Rich or poor, folks often shared beds with family members, servants, apprentices, or even strangers during travel. For warmth, for safety, for lack of options. Sometimes 2 or 3 to a bed, sometimes more. The closer to the fire you sleep, the higher your rank, or your ability to call dibs. It's hard to imagine today, but back then, people didn't expect silence and solitude for sleep. A good night not being too cold, not being stepped on, and not waking up with something crawling in your blanket. Still, bedtime had its small comforts. Maybe someone hums softly across the room. Maybe you roll over onto your other side and find a slightly less lumpy spot in the mattress. The candle finally gutters out. Darkness wraps around you like a second blanket, thick and total. There are no streetlights leaking through the shutters, no LED glow from a phone on the nightstand, just blackness and the warmth of tired limbs, the smells of straw and sweat and wood smoke, the breathing of others nearby, and, hopefully, no fleas. Interestingly, historians still argue whether the communal nature of sleep made people feel more secure or more stressed. Was it soothing to drift off beside your family, or did it just mean more interruptions? Did shared nighttime rituals deepen bonds or breed resentment when someone snored like a broken bellows? As you lie there, half dreaming, half waiting for true sleep, you understand one thing clearly. Bedtime in the medieval world was not a private affair. It was a communal, noisy, smelly, sometimes comically inconvenient necessity, and it was very, very real. So now you're lying in this creaky wooden bed with your knees slightly bent because it's not quite long enough, and you start to notice something odd. This thing feels important, not just for sleeping. It dominates the whole room like a stage set, draped with dusty wool curtains or linen hangings that flutter whenever someone opens a door. In fact, it might be the most expensive object in the entire household, because in the Middle Ages, your bed wasn't just where you slept. It was, for all intents and purposes, your throne. Let's say you're wealthy, or at least well off. That means your bed is likely carved out of heavy oak, with ornate posts rising tall as a person. The headboard might be engraved with patterns, religious symbols, or your family's coat of arms. There's a canopy too, not for style, although yes, it looks fabulous, but to catch the cold that falls like mist from stone ceilings. These curtains weren't just for warmth either. They gave you privacy in rooms that were otherwise shared, or where servants came and went constantly. And if you had a really fancy setup, the entire bed might be enclosed like a tiny wooden house. Good luck to your claustrophobia. This wasn't just a sleeping arrangement, it was a flex. A 15th century noble might even host guests from bed, like a slightly smellier version of a talk show host. The bedchamber was both private and public. People came to present petitions, gossip, or in royal circles, observe the birth of an heir. Imagine holding court in your pajamas while trying to suppress a yawn. Of course, if you were a peasant, or even a town merchant, you probably weren't lounging in a walnut wood masterpiece. More likely, your bed was a rough bench pushed against the wall, or a frame of ropes holding up a straw mattress. Sometimes there wasn't a frame at all, just the mattress on the ground, perhaps with a simple bolster under your head and a blanket woven from coarse wool or discarded cloth. But even these humble beds had meaning. For the average person, a proper bed was something to aspire to. It might be the first thing you saved up for when starting a household. It got mentioned in wills, passed on to children, even pledged as collateral for debts. If someone in your family died, the bed they died in might be carefully documented, not because it was creepy, but because it was valuable. And those medieval wills, they're kind of fascinating. You'll find entries like, "I leave to my son William my best feather bed with blue embroidered coverlet, and to my daughter Alice the good bed that stands near the hearth." Yes, people had more than one bed. No, it didn't mean they were rich. It just meant they were accumulating the medieval equivalent of IKEA's finest. But it wasn't just what the bed was made of, it was where it stood. In castles, the master bed might sit raised on a dais with tapestries behind it to show off one's wealth and good taste. In smaller homes, it might be tucked in a corner near the fire, separated by a curtain or screen. And if you were part of a truly cramped household, the bedroom was basically the room. All of it. Cooking, working, eating, sleeping, in one chaotic, smoky square. One interesting little fringe tidbit. Some people believe the position of your bed could influence your health or dreams. Sleep with your head pointing north, they said, and you'd rest better. Others swore by sleeping facing east for divine favor. Then again, some folks had so little room they just flopped in whatever direction didn't send them tumbling into a wall. Historians still argue whether medieval people cared more about the material comfort of their beds or the symbolic power they represented. Was the bed primarily a social signal or a rare moment of softness in an otherwise back-breaking life? Whatever the answer, one thing's clear. To the medieval eye, a bed wasn't just a rectangle with blankets. It was a layered expression of status, faith, practicality, and personality. It told a story of who you were, how you lived, and whether or not your back would be completely destroyed by age 40. So you curl in now, taking in the musty scent of wool and wood polish. The rope creaks as you shift, maybe someone snores, maybe a mouse darts beneath the floorboards. But here, in this room, under these covers, you found your place in the nightly ritual. A quiet moment of pause between the frantic rhythms of medieval life. And no matter your rank, whether you're a farmer with hay in your boots or a Dutch or in rings still on your fingers, there's one universal truth. This bed, however modest, however drafty, is yours for the night. You shift again in bed, trying to find a less saggy spot, and that's when you notice the odd bounce beneath you. It's not just the straw mattress, it's the bed ropes. That's right, you're literally suspended on a kind of woven net of cords stretched across a wooden frame, and if no one's tightened them lately, your entire body is slowly sinking into the dreaded hammock slump. Congratulations, now you know exactly what it meant to sleep tight. Beds in the medieval period often relied on rope supports instead of solid slats or springs. Think of them like a low-tech trampoline, but way less fun. The ropes were strung horizontally across the bed frame, forming a web that held up the mattress, usually a lumpy sack filled with straw, feathers, wool, or whatever soft-ish material was lying around. Over time, those ropes sagged, and to fix that, you had to quite literally tighten them, hence the phrase. Sleep tight was less of a cute bedtime wish and more of a practical reminder. Use a bed key, a wooden tool shaped like a crank, or just your bare hands to twist the cords tighter. Do it right and the bed firms up, giving you a bit of bounce and lift. Do it wrong and you might spend the night slowly sliding toward the floor, listening to your joints complain in medieval. And if you were a servant or apprentice, guess who had to do the tightening? That's right, another fine addition to the already exciting to-do list: chamber pots, wood chopping, bed ropes. It's not glamorous, but it was a fact of daily life. Interestingly, rope beds weren't limited to peasants. Even wealthier households used them. The difference was in the quality: tighter craftsmanship, better wood, smoother rope, and if you were really fancy, a mattress stuffed with goose down instead of oat chaff. Goose down was so fluffy and luxurious that some noble families guarded their mattresses like treasure chests. Others filled them with herbs like lavender, thyme, or chamomile to ward off pests and evil dreams. Bonus: it made the bed smell slightly less like wet dog. And let's not forget the mattress rotation ritual. Since mattresses weren't quilted or evenly stuffed, people regularly flipped and beat them to redistribute the filling. It was noisy. It was dusty. It was someone's job. And if the bed had been shared with, say, a traveler or a sick relative, you'd better hope someone remembered to let it air out before you crawled in. There's a certain charm to it, though, isn't there? The idea that going to bed was a ritual. You had to pull back the curtains, smooth the wrinkled linens, adjust the bolster pillow, tighten the ropes. It wasn't just flop down and scroll TikTok until your phone hits your face. It was active, tactile, slightly inconvenient, and yet somehow more satisfying. Historians still debate whether most medieval people truly prioritized comfort, or if they just made do with what they had. Was the bed rope system a genius low-tech solution, or just the best bad option before box springs came along? Either way, it worked. And some of those rope beds, carefully preserved, are still around today. Museums across Europe hold examples, bed frames with carved spindles and the telltale notches where ropes once ran. In some folk villages, they even demonstrate rope tightening as part of historical reenactments. It's oddly soothing to watch, like weaving, but more immediately useful. So here you are now, lying flat on a bed that someone, maybe you, took care to tighten. It still sags a bit. One corner squeaks when you move. But you've tucked the blanket around your feet, and the mattress feels almost firm. Not bad, considering it was last fluffed with a stick. Outside, the wind brushes past the shutters. The rope creaks again, just slightly, with every breath you take. You can smell the faint earthy tang of the straw, and maybe the leftover hint of herbs someone mixed in. There's something deeply grounding about it, a reminder that even in the past, people cared enough about a good night's sleep to engineer solutions, however humble. Rope beds, feather mattresses, sleep-tight sayings, they all point to the same quiet truth. Even back then, bedtime was sacred. You had chores to do before it, rituals to perform, and whether you slept alone or packed in like books on a shelf, you wanted that last hour of the day to feel safe. So tighten the ropes, plump the straw, and pull the wool blanket up to your chin. Your night has just begun. Sometime after drifting off, you wake up. Not all the way, just enough to realize it's quiet. Too quiet. The fire's burned down to coals, the bed has cooled, a few feet away, someone stirs and coughs, then another rustle, another sigh, and it hits you. It's the middle of the night, and you're not done sleeping yet. Welcome to segmented sleep. This wasn't some rare condition. In the medieval world, it was normal. People expected to sleep in two chunks, what they called first sleep and second sleep. And in between, that was your golden hour, or more accurately, your candlelit, half-dreamy, stew-warmed window of time. Here's how it worked. Most folks went to bed a couple of hours after sunset. They'd fall into their first sleep, usually lasting about 4 hours. Then, poof, around midnight or a bit after, they'd wake up, not in a panic, just awake, for maybe an hour, maybe 2. During that gap, you might sit quietly, pray, stoke the fire, use the chamber pot, or if you were lucky, sneak into the kitchen for some warm ale or leftover barley pottage thickened into something almost solid. That's right. Midnight snacks are not a modern invention. Imagine sipping hot spiced milk while wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, your feet just barely warmed by the glowing embers. And then, after the interlude, you'd drift off again for your second sleep. Another 4 hours if you were lucky. Then the roosters would start up and the world would return. It's hard to imagine today. Most of us panic if we wake at 2:47 a.m. and can't fall back asleep in 10 minutes. But back then, it was just what people did. In fact, there are dozens of references to first and second sleep in medieval writings. Court records, diary entries, medical texts. One 13th century monk advised patients to take advantage of the waking interval to contemplate one's sins with a calm mind. Very soothing. But not everyone used the time for spiritual reflection. If you were married, this interlude was seen as prime time for, well, marital bonding. Physicians of the era even claimed this was when the body was most relaxed and receptive. Make of that what you will. Others used the quiet hour to think. Dream interpretation was popular, especially among clergy and scholars. You might wake from a strange image, sit by the fire, and try to unravel its meaning. Did the goat with 3 heads signify a good harvest or a very bad neighbor? And sometimes the gap was practical. If you were a servant or lived in a busy house, this was the only quiet hour to sneak off and do something personal. Mend your only shirt, steal a quick prayer, or just stare at the glowing coals and let your thoughts float, unbothered. Historians still argue whether segmented sleep was universal or more common in certain regions or classes. Did peasants with brutal workdays follow this pattern, or just the wealthier classes with more flexible hours? Some believe it was encouraged by the natural darkness of winter, when nights stretched impossibly long. Others think it's simply how human sleep cycles function when freed from artificial lighting, and oddly, it might be our default mode. Studies in sleep science show that when modern people are put in complete darkness for long periods, they often revert to segmented sleep without prompting, as if our brains have been waiting all along to return to this 2-act play. But here's the part that's especially dreamy. People didn't fight it. They accepted it, even savored it. That middle hour wasn't lost time, it was sacred time, the hush between wakefulness and sleep, a space for stillness, reflection, or a quiet snack you didn't have to share. So now, as you lie in your medieval bed, maybe half awake, maybe not, you sense that it's okay. You don't need to panic. This is the hour between dreams. You can stretch, pull the covers back up, or just lie there, listening to the crackle of a dying fire and the breathing of others, soft and rhythmic, all around you. There's no rush. The second sleep will come. The fire is just glowing embers now. The room is cooler, the air a little damp, and in the darkness, you hear someone roll over with a grunt. You're still nestled in your bed, or more accurately, crammed into it, and you start to notice the soft press of elbows and knees around you. Not just your own. Someone's foot is definitely in your space. Maybe 2 someone's, because in the Middle Ages, you almost never slept alone. In fact, the concept of a private bed or a private bedroom was laughably modern. Most people, especially those without wealth, shared sleeping space as a matter of necessity. Families often slept together, layered like laundry. Parents, children, the occasional cousin, and maybe even a maidservant or 2. Some would be on the mattress. Others, wrapped in cloaks or sheepskins, curled up on the rush-covered floor nearby. And it wasn't always family. Travelers staying in inns might share a bed with total strangers. You'd show up, pay your coin, and be pointed toward a mattress where another weary guest was already asleep, snoring into the pillow. "Get in," the innkeeper might grunt. Feet to feet. If you were lucky, your bedmate didn't talk in their sleep, or steal covers. Even within households, sleeping arrangements reflected rank, relationship, and utility. A noble woman might share her bed with her ladies-in-waiting. Apprentices often bunked near or even with their masters. Wet nurses, servants, and children all nested in around their employers like orbiting moons. It wasn't about intimacy, it was about warmth, safety, and squeezing the most out of limited space. Of course, for the upper classes, things could get a little more elegant. Rich folks might have separate sleeping chambers with spouses in different rooms entirely. A lord and lady might only share a bed during specific visits, negotiations, or ahem purposes. Their servants, however, often slept nearby on pallets or benches, always within earshot and sometimes within reach. No such thing as privacy when your job is to refill the candle or fetch hot stones for cold feet. There's an old French term, coucher à la dure, meaning to sleep rough, and it applied even in seemingly nice homes. Hard floors, minimal bedding, and frequent disturbances were standard. Dogs might sleep indoors for warmth. So might chickens. Infants and toddlers were bundled between adults like tiny, wriggling radiators. Every shift, sigh, or nighttime sneeze became part of the lullaby. And in case you're wondering about the social etiquette of such close quarters, yes, it got awkward. But norms evolved. People turned to face walls, pulled up hoods, or made quiet noises to signal they weren't listening. Much like riding public transit today, a subtle agreement to pretend no one else exists. Interestingly, historians still argue whether this communal sleep fostered closer social bonds or simply increased everyone's tolerance for discomfort. Some suggest that sharing a bed encouraged a sense of community and reduced nighttime anxiety. Others believe it just made people better at ignoring each other. A quirky detail from 14th century court records: a woman once brought legal action against her roommate, who she also shared a bed with, for whispering secrets in her sleep. Apparently everyone else in the room heard it. So yes, your dreams could become public record. One fringe practice that crops up occasionally: rotating sleepers. In households with many laborers or extended family members, people sometimes slept in shifts. When one person rose early to start work, another would take their spot in the still warm bedding. Beds were valuable, and warmth was not to be wasted. And yet, even among the crowding, the bed still retained some intimacy. Mothers nursed babies in the dark. Spouses exchanged hushed words. Children nestled into crooks of elbows. Night was noisy, but it also held small moments of quiet comfort. So now, picture yourself surrounded, not alone, but enveloped by the breathing warmth of others. It's a strange feeling at first, but not unpleasant, a kind of shared trust. You all live under the same roof, after all. Sleep comes in layers, some shallow, some deep. You turn, adjust your blanket, and someone else does the same a heartbeat later. It's a sleepy symphony of shared rhythms, snorts, and the occasional muttered dream fragment. And somewhere in that closeness, in the tangle of limbs and whispers, the steady rise and fall of a dozen chests, you find a surprising stillness. Not isolation, but belonging. You're still nestled under your rough-spun blanket, the bed ropes creaking softly beneath you. But now your attention drifts to what you're wearing, or rather what everyone else is wearing to bed. Or not wearing. And, well, it's complicated, because medieval pajamas weren't really a thing. For most people, bedtime attire was either exactly what you'd worn that day, or, as the evening got cooler, something even simpler. A long linen shift, a woolen tunic, or nothing at all. That's right, in many households, sleeping naked was not particularly scandalous. You and the entire family might all turn in together under one roof in varying degrees of undress. Modesty was relative, and warmth took priority. If you were a peasant, odds are you slept in your base layer, a camise or a shirt long enough to cover your knees, probably the same one you worked in, sweated through, and would wear again tomorrow. This wasn't laziness, it was just practicality. Laundry day came maybe once a week, if that. Besides, taking off all your layers just to redress in the morning wasn't worth the effort when your room was so cold that your breath formed clouds. On the other hand, if you were wealthy, that's where things got fancy. The nobility had special nightshirts made of softer linen, sometimes even silk, if you were scandalously rich and mildly reckless. And yes, there were such things as embroidered nightcaps. Picture a tall hat flopping slightly to one side like the world's least aerodynamic traffic cone. These weren't just for style. They helped retain body heat and, in some cases, protect elaborate hairstyles from collapsing into birds' nests. One especially stylish 15th century noblewoman reportedly had a set of 7 nightgowns, each dyed with different herbs to scent the fabric and ward off dreams she considered too vivid. A medieval sleep influencer, if you will. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Your nighttime attire wasn't just about comfort, it was often tied to morality. Religious texts from the period sometimes warned against excessive luxury at bedtime. Too fine a nightshirt? Vanity, too much perfume, sinful indulgence. Too naked, temptation. Too layered, pride. Basically, if you were cozy, someone out there probably disapproved. Historians still argue whether most people viewed bedclothes as purely functional or loaded with cultural meaning. Did a wool nightcap signal piety, or just cold ears? Was embroidered linen a mark of status or a whispered scandal? The records vary, and much depended on geography, gender, and social class. And speaking of gender, women's sleepwear often doubled as modesty armor. A linen shift covered most of the body, but still allowed for quick nursing or tending to children in the middle of the night. In convents, nuns slept fully clothed, sometimes even in belts or scapulars, ready to leap into midnight prayer at a moment's notice. There were even rules about not sleeping too comfortably, lest it distract from spiritual discipline. Monastic bedtime, not known for its plush amenities. Men, meanwhile, might sleep shirtless, or in a tunic, or in nothing at all, depending on the climate and how many other people they were sharing the bed with. Soldiers on campaign might wear full armor to bed. Well, at least their padded gambesons, just in case someone decided to raid the camp at 2 a.m. And if you were a sailor, you probably just collapsed in your salt-stained breeches wherever space allowed, maybe under a barrel if the wind was sharp. One quirky fringe practice. In some medieval households, folks would air out their sleeping shifts by hanging them over their bed ropes during the day, not just to dry them, but to let the linen absorb the scent of herbs scattered through the rushes. Imagine sleeping each night wrapped in a whisper of mint, lavender, and crushed bay leaf. Not exactly Chanel No. 5, but surprisingly pleasant. So now you lie back in your own imagined linen shift, cool against your skin, and pull the wool blanket up to your chest. Maybe you're wearing a nightcap, floppy, slightly ridiculous, but warm. You might even feel the faintest scent of crushed thyme rising from the folds. There's something soothing about it, even if your sleeves are itchy and one of the seams is unraveling. You shift again, careful not to bump the person next to you, and listen as the room exhales. Clothes rustle. Feet shuffle beneath covers. Someone murmurs in their sleep, probably dreaming about baked apples or runaway goats. And you too let your eyes close, wrapped in the peculiar patchwork of medieval bedtime fashion, equal parts warmth, tradition, and whatever was hanging on the wall at dusk. You wake briefly again, only this time it's not a dream or your neighbor's elbow in your side. It's an itch, a very specific itch, on your forearm, then your ankle, then, distressingly, your scalp. Congratulations, you've met the unofficial bedfellows of the medieval night, fleas, lice, and the ever-charming bedbug. Because for all the effort people put into their beds, hygiene wasn't quite what you'd call modern. Feather beds and straw mattresses were cozy in theory, but they also made excellent homes for insects. Warm, dark, and full of human crumbs. Literally. Let's start with the mattress. Most people slept on a ticking, a large fabric sack stuffed with straw, feathers, rags, or reeds. Over time, these materials compacted, rotted, or attracted pests. The stuffing got lumpy. The cloth wore thin. And since you couldn't exactly toss it in the washer, you dealt with it the best you could. You beat it with a stick. That's not a joke. Beating the bedding was a standard chore. You'd drag the mattress outside, thwack it with a rod, and shake loose the dust, mites, and whatever else had taken up residence. If you were really thorough, you might restuff it with fresh straw, though not too fresh unless you enjoy sleeping on a crunchy meadow. For feather beds, the upkeep was even more intense. You had to plump them regularly, stitch up tiers, and hope no mice burrowed into the corners. And yes, mice absolutely did that. A well-stuffed bed was warm for more than just humans. But back to your itchy arms. Bedbugs were a fact of life, so were fleas. And while you might think of these as peasant problems, they were completely democratic. Nobles with silk sheets were just as vulnerable as shepherds with sheepskin blankets. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly complained about being bitten in her own palace. At least one 13th century French physician advised sleeping with a sprig of wormwood to repel pestilent creatures of the mattress. Helpful, probably not effective. And the linens, well, they got boiled, occasionally. Wealthier folks might change sheets once every week or two. For the rest, it was more like once a season, or when guests came over. Maybe. This meant that the average person was fairly accustomed to scratching at night. Lice combs were as common as table knives. Children were frequently shaved bald to help manage infestations. Adults, too, sometimes kept their hair short, not for fashion, but for delousing. And if you were lucky enough to live near a bathhouse, you might occasionally treat yourself to a long soak and a vinegar rinse. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly dirty by their own standards, or just had different ideas about cleanliness. It's possible that a faint, persistent itch wasn't considered unusual, just part of life, like cold feet or shared beds. After all, if everyone's scratching, it stops being noteworthy. One fringe remedy that pops up in household manuals? Sleeping with a chunk of apple in your bed. Not to eat, to attract bugs away from you. The idea was that pests would crawl into the fruit and leave you in peace, like a tiny, fruity decoy pillow. It's unclear how well it worked. Probably about as well as the other popular tactic, sleeping with a candle lit nearby to burn the foul air, which mostly just made the room smell like smoky linen and mild panic. Yet people still took pride in their beds. They embroidered pillowcases. They perfumed the sheets. They even, occasionally, hung sprigs of dried herbs like tansy or lavender from the bedposts to ward off bad dreams and biting things alike. These gestures weren't just decorative. They were defenses in the nightly battle against discomfort. So here you are in your lumpy, lovingly maintained straw mattress. You scratch once, maybe twice. Then pull the blanket up anyway, because you've done all you can. Beaten the bedding, boiled the linens, maybe even bribed the cat to sleep near your feet and scare off mice. You're clean enough by the standards of your time, and besides, the snoring on your left is louder than the itching now. The fire has faded to ash. The darkness is complete, and if something rustles near the corner of the room, you tell yourself it's just the rushes settling or the apple doing its job. Sleep is patient, and so are the fleas. A rooster crows far too early. Someone groans beside you. A pair of feet hit the rush-covered floor with a dull thump. Morning, medieval style, has begun, and just like that, the stillness of night is gone. But here's the thing. This isn't the modern morning where alarms blare and espresso flows. No one leaps out of bed to tackle a productivity spreadsheet. In the medieval world, waking up was more like a slow emergence. Bodies stretched, fires were coaxed back to life. Someone fumbled with flint and steel to relight a candle stub. The air inside the room is chilly, with that distinctive breath cloud chill that tells you it's definitely time to move. But you really, really don't want to. You pull your blanket up, just for a moment longer. Your nightshirt clings a little, your hair is flattened. Someone's elbow has left a dent in your ribs. But you survived the night, bugs and all, and that's no small thing. In fact, in this era, it's almost a daily miracle. Let's be honest, getting a full night's rest in the Middle Ages was a bit of an extreme sport. Between shared beds, itchy sheets, creaky ropes, unpredictable fires, midnight interludes, and an entire zoo's worth of domestic animals roaming around, uninterrupted sleep was more of a wish than a guarantee. But now it's daylight, or something close to it. Outside, there's a pale gray light pressing at the shutters. If you're a farmer, this means the animals are stirring. If you're in a city, the distant clatter of carts and shouting vendors might already be starting. Either way, you know the morning tasks are piling up fast. Still, there's a bit of time left. The second sleep was always supposed to carry you into dawn, and not everyone leaped out of bed the moment the sky turned blue. Some stayed tucked in, whispering quietly to each other or saying prayers, or just lying still. In some homes, this was the only quiet time before the chaos began. Now, let's talk about one of the weirder, cozier parts of medieval mornings, the concept of lying in. Not childbirth, though that's what it became later. No, this was the brief, socially sanctioned moment where you stayed in bed on purpose, especially if you were of higher status. Nobles might take breakfast in bed, dictating letters while servants laid out hot ale, buttered bread, or pottage thickened with last night's leftovers. The bed became a workplace, a breakfast nook, and a low-energy throne, all in one. And if you were religious, and most people were, morning prayers might be mumbled while still horizontal. Monks and nuns had formal rules about rising, but even they sometimes struggled with the urge to stay bundled a bit longer. After all, stone cloisters get cold. There's a famous passage in a 12th century abbey chronicle where a novice tries to sneak in 5 extra minutes under his blanket before the bell rings. The punishment? No breakfast. Truly medieval justice. Interestingly, historians still debate whether medieval people were chronically sleep-deprived or just adapted to their broken-up routines. Was segmented sleep restful? Was the second sleep deep and dreamless, or just a nap with ambitions? The debate continues. We do know that people found ways to make the most of their mornings, however strange or slow. And of course, the day's first meal wasn't exactly brunch. For peasants, it might be a crust of bread and a bit of ale. Something you could chew while pulling on boots or tending to animals. If you were lucky, there might be a hunk of cheese or some leftover stew. And for those who really had to hurry, a raw onion eaten on the way out the door. Medieval energy bar. Still lying in bed, just a little longer. The fire's crackling again. Someone's added rushes to the floor. A dog pads past your mattress and sniffs your foot with judgmental eyes. You sigh. Your limbs feel heavy but rested. Sort of. The mattress is still lumpy. The bed ropes are probably overdue for another tightening. But you've made it through the night, through 2 sleeps, and into the gentle chaos of the morning. You stretch, elbowing someone gently. They grunt. You sit up slowly, pulling the wool blanket aside, and feel the cold bite of air on your skin. You're not ready. But that's okay. No one really is. You finally sit up, rubbing your eyes with one hand while the other fumbles for something warm, maybe a hood, or your day shirt, still damp from yesterday's rain. You sniff it. Not great, but not the worst. You'll wear it anyway. And that's when the smells hit you. Not unpleasant, necessarily. Just vivid. You're sitting in a medieval bedroom, after all, so it smells like stale rushes, slightly damp wool, wood smoke, body odor, and maybe a hint of onion from someone's late-night snack. And then there's the faint earthy scent of something you'd almost forgotten. The chamber pot. Yes, this is the part of bedtime no one likes to remember, but absolutely everyone had to deal with. Because in the Middle Ages, getting up to use the bathroom wasn't simple. There were no en-suites, no porcelain thrones, no light switches and heated seats. If you needed to go in the night, you had 2 options. Wake up fully, wrap yourself in a cloak, brave the freezing hallway, or worse, the courtyard, and find the latrine. Or stay warm and use the chamber pot sitting under your bed. Guess which one most people chose? Chamber pots were as common as pillows, little ceramic or metal bowls with handles, often stored under the bed or beside it. You'd slide it out, do your business in the dark, and slide it back, gently. No one wants a spill at 3 a.m. And yes, sometimes they had lids, but not always, hence the smell. In wealthier homes, servants emptied them in the morning. In poorer homes, you might take it out yourself and toss the contents into the midden heap or down the designated corner of the yard. In cities, things got trickier. Some folks emptied their pots right into the street from an upper window, usually shouting, "Garde l'eau," a French warning that loosely translates to, "Look out below." And if you didn't move fast enough, well, medieval street life had its hazards. And it wasn't just humans. Cats, rats, even the odd chicken might wander indoors at night, especially in colder months. The family bedchamber wasn't a pristine retreat. It was a living, snoring, scratching, very real space. Babies might relieve themselves right in the straw. Toddlers occasionally wet the mattress. You dealt with it. You changed the rushes, rinsed the cloth, aired it out. Eventually. Historians still argue whether chamber pots were used routinely every night or only in winter, when the cold made a trip outside unbearable. Some suggest that in rural areas, people preferred the open air, just a short walk to the edge of a field or hedge. Others point out that in crowded towns, pots were a necessity, not a luxury. One quirky detail: some wealthier households commissioned painted chamber pots with humorous or even risque designs. Imagine sitting down to relieve yourself and finding a cartoonish face staring up at you. A kind of medieval bathroom humor, because if you're going to squat in the dark, you might as well do it with a laugh. And, oddly enough, there were etiquette rules. If you were a guest in someone's home and needed the pot, you'd whisper your request or gesture subtly. Some hosts provided shared chamber pots for multiple guests, an uncomfortable but common reality. The alternative? Waiting until sunrise and hoping your bladder cooperated. Now you swing your legs over the edge of the bed and place your feet gently on the floor, careful not to knock over the pot. Someone nearby is already bundling themselves up for the day. Another person is muttering a prayer. You sit quietly for a moment, wrapping your blanket around your shoulders, letting the air touch your skin and adjusting to the early light. And despite the chamber pot, the creaky bed ropes, the itching, and the general lack of privacy, there's something quietly satisfying about this morning. You survived the long medieval night. You're a little stiff, a little cold, but you're awake and alive. And that counts for something. You look around the room at the drying linens, the guttering candle, the bundle of rushes someone has already swept into the corner. You hear the familiar morning noises, coughing, footsteps, the scrape of a pot being stirred somewhere nearby. Another day is beginning, and the bed behind you already feels like a memory. You finally stand, one hand on the bedpost for balance, and stretch just enough to pop a few joints you didn't know could creak like that. The wool blanket slips from your shoulders, and the morning chill rushes in to greet your spine like an old, unwelcome friend. Time to get dressed, and not just for warmth, but for public decency, because very soon, others will start moving through this space. That's the thing about medieval bedchambers. They rarely stayed private for long, but before the room fills with footsteps and chatter, let's talk about the bedchamber itself, because it wasn't always a separate room. In many medieval homes, especially smaller ones, bedroom wasn't a distinct concept. You slept where you could. That might be near the fire in a loft above the animals or on a bench pushed close to a wall. Only the wealthiest had chambers just for sleeping. And even then, a noble bedchamber was rarely for sleep alone. In fact, it functioned like a multi-purpose suite. The bedchamber was where you held informal meetings, shared secrets, entertained close guests, dressed, ate breakfast, nursed babies, and, if you had the rank, received your physician or confessor. It was private, sure, but not off limits. More like a VIP lounge than a sealed-off retreat. The centerpiece, of course, was the bed itself, especially if you were wealthy. Canopy beds weren't just a design flex. They helped to keep warmth in and insects out. Heavy drapes, often lined with wool or fur, turned the sleeping area into a tented sanctuary. Some had built-in benches at the end for servants to sit on or to store bedding and clothing. The wood was carved, sometimes painted, the curtains embroidered. It was not a humble affair, and yet, even those draped beds didn't guarantee solitude. Servants came and went, especially in the morning. Maids brought water in copper pitchers for washing. Pages stood ready with clean underlayers. If you were a high-ranking noble, your day might start with an audience, literally. People came to watch you wake up. A French courtier once recorded a visit to a duke's chamber where 12 people were present while the duke lay in bed, propped on embroidered pillows, giving orders and nibbling sweetened figs. And yes, someone nearby was emptying the chamber pot. Royalty, glamorous and gross in equal measure. For regular folk, the bedchamber was often a shared, chaotic space. A family room by night, it transformed by day into a workroom or gathering area. The bed might be pushed to the wall or left unmade, surrounded by baskets of laundry or piles of wool for spinning. The hearth stayed warm if someone kept feeding it. Children ran in and out. Neighbors might stop by. Privacy was more of a theory than a guarantee. Historians still debate whether medieval people even valued privacy in the way we do. Was the concept of personal space culturally irrelevant or simply unattainable for most? Some argue that status came with the illusion of privacy, curtains, doors, screens, but sound still traveled, and even behind a curtain, you might be fully dressed and carrying on a conversation with someone standing a few feet away, preparing a bowl of barley mash. One odd but fascinating detail? Some noble women kept journals, or had scribes take notes in the bedchamber. Not necessarily about dreams, but about morning thoughts, conversations, or family matters. The idea of the bed as a thinking place, as well as a sleeping one, was not unusual. And if you were sick, the bedchamber became a medical theater. Herbalists or surgeons were invited in. Windows were propped open to let out the bad air, Visitors brought soft foods or religious relics. Beds might be surrounded by icons, flowers, or even fresh herbs scattered on the rushes, all in the hope of encouraging healing dreams, or at least discouraging foul humors. Now you glance around your own chamber, humble or grand, private or packed, and take in the morning transformation. The blanket is folded. The mattress looks like it lost a wrestling match. Someone is shaking out linens near the window. Another is coaxing the fire back to life with a puff of breath and a twig. You notice a gap in the curtain where sunlight sneaks through, dust swirling like soft gold. And somehow, the room feels different now. Less shadowy, less intimate. The bed is no longer a cave, it's part of the world again. The chamber shifts from rest to readiness. You step carefully across the rushes as the floor cool and uneven beneath your feet. The bed creaks behind you as someone else climbs in for a stolen nap or a midday lie down. Because in a world without rigid schedules, the bed never really sleeps alone. You're finally up and fully dressed. Well, fully is a generous term. You've pulled on your tunic, secured your belt, maybe even tugged a woolen hood over your head if it's especially drafty. But before you can think about breakfast, or whatever passes for it, you stop for a moment, remembering something important. The bed ropes. That's right. Before the day officially begins, someone in the household has to sleep tight the beds. The phrase sleep tight didn't start as a cutesy bedtime wish. It was literal. And you're about to see why. Medieval beds weren't all feather fluff and poetry. Most were wooden frames with a kind of rope lattice work stretched across to support the mattress. Think of it like a crisscrossing web of thick cord or hemp woven tightly between notches and hooks along the bed frame. On top of that went the mattress, usually a big cloth sack stuffed with straw, feathers, or a lumpy mix of both. The ropes bore all the weight, so over time they stretched and sagged. You'd wake up feeling like you'd slept in a hammock that gave up halfway through the night. So every few days, or more often in fancier homes, someone would retighten the ropes using a special tool, the bed key. It looked a bit like a crank handle. You'd wedge it into a loop near the bed's corner, then turn and twist until the ropes pulled taut again. The bed would groan a little, the frame might creak, and suddenly your mattress was firm again. Well, firmer. Let's not pretend it became memory foam. In poorer homes, tightening the bed was a daily chore. The rope sagged faster under heavier use, especially with multiple people sharing the space. Children might be tasked with crawling underneath to check for weak spots. And if the rope snapped, you tied a knot and hoped for the best. Historians still argue whether the phrase sleep tight emerged exactly from this practice or if it evolved later when rope beds became more widespread. But there's no doubt that tightening ropes was part of medieval bed maintenance, and that a well-strung bed made a big difference. And of course, tight ropes weren't just about comfort. A sagging bed could cause the mattress to bunch, tip, or even partially collapse. Imagine rolling toward your bedmate in the middle of the night, not from affection, but because gravity decided you needed a new spooning partner. There were fringe tricks to improve the bed's firmness. Some people wove the ropes in alternating patterns, crosswise and lengthwise, while others doubled up ropes or added extra knots in the middle for support. In colder months, a fur or blanket might be placed between the ropes and the mattress to cut drafts rising from the floor. Smart layering. But even the best-maintained bed had limits. Rope beds groaned, they shifted, they squeaked in protest with every turn like a chorus of disgruntled floorboards, which, in a crowded room, meant everyone knew when you rolled over, or, more awkwardly, when you weren't alone. It wasn't all practical. Some beds were things of beauty. The frames might be carved with elaborate scenes, biblical stories, hunting scenes, geometric patterns. Headboards featured family crests or Latin inscriptions. One surviving 15th century bed frame includes a quote reminding sleepers to thank God upon waking, for dreams are fragile and sleep is his gift. So yes, bedside inspiration isn't new. Once the ropes are tight and the mattress fluffed as best it can be, you give the bed a final pat. Not exactly military corners, but passable. Someone nearby eyes your handiwork and gives a grunt of approval. In some homes, tidying the bed was a point of pride. In others, it was just something you did before breakfast. And then there's the really ceremonial stuff. In wealthier households, beds were sometimes blessed. A priest might sprinkle holy water over a newly married couple's mattress, or say a few words when a sickbed was prepared. Some folks even sewed charms into the bed ticking, small cloth packets containing herbs, prayers, or even teeth. Yes, teeth. We won't ask. So now, with the ropes pulled taut, the bed looking vaguely composed, and the rest of the room bustling toward daily life, you step back. Another night's rest preserved. Another ritual complete. Your part in the ancient bedtime maintenance chain has been fulfilled. And next time someone tells you to sleep tight, you'll know they're not just being sweet. They're reminding you gently to check your ropes, because even dreams need structure. You leave the room behind now, tight bed ropes, scratched floor rushes, lingering fire smoke and all. But bedtime doesn't just live in the bed. In medieval life, preparing to sleep began well before nightfall, and involved more ritual than you might expect. You're headed now toward the kitchen hearth, or the center of the hall if you're in a smaller home, where a pot still simmers with the dregs of yesterday's supper. Morning light trickles in through high, narrow windows, but your thoughts drift forward already to the next sunset and what you'll need to do when it arrives. Because back then, winding down for sleep was a whole process, and not a quick one. Let's start with the fire. The hearth was the literal and symbolic heart of the household. It provided heat, light, cooking power, and at night, it became your only source of security against the darkness. So when dusk approached, someone would tend the fire carefully, bank it with ash to keep it glowing through the night. A smoldering hearth could be coaxed back to life in the morning with dry twigs and a bit of breath. It was cheaper than striking a fresh flame, and frankly, less of a hassle. And that glowing fire wasn't just practical. It was emotional comfort, too. Light in a time when true darkness came quickly and fully. No city glow, no backlit screens. Once the sun went down, night ruled completely. This is why evening routines often centered around that warm glow. People gathered by it, eating their final meal, called supper, or in some cases, the humble-sounding evening bread. They shared stories, mended clothes, sharpened tools. Children might play or drift off in someone's lap. A grandmother stirred the embers. A father whittled. Everyone slowly wound themselves down like turning a key in reverse. Even in monasteries, the end of day was marked with rhythm and ritual. The bell for Compline, the final prayer service, called everyone into silence. Monks filed into their cells or dormitories by candlelight, whispering hymns, lowering their voices, walking slowly in a world already growing still. Back in a lay household, your evening might involve other preparations. Rinsing your feet in cool water, reciting a prayer, or checking the mattress for mice, again. Some people walked the house perimeter before bed, latching shutters and securing doors with wooden bars. A farmer might do one last check on animals. A city merchant might tally the day's coin box by candlelight, blowing gently on the flame when he was done. And that brings us to the candles. Oh, the candles. Tallow for the poor, beeswax for the rich, smoky, dripping, temperamental candles that gave just enough light to read a face, maybe a letter if you squinted. You might own one or two candles at most. They were precious, and their slow burn was carefully watched. Running through too many candles meant waste. Waste meant hunger. There's a reason bedtime stories didn't go on for hours. In some wealthier homes, candle clocks were used. You'd mark the wax with pins, and as the candle melted down, the pins would fall with a faint plink, measuring time. An hourglass made of fire. One pin left meant it was truly time for bed. Historians still argue whether families cherished this nightly routine or simply endured it. Was it a moment of peace or boredom? One chronicler from 14th century London complained that the long candle lasts longer than patience, suggesting some folks grew weary of this slow, flickering descent into darkness. Still, others describe the hush of evening as deeply comforting, a time to reflect, speak softly, and feel the rhythms of the home slow into silence. A fringe tradition from rural Bavaria had children whisper their dreams into small cloth bags and hang them by the fire overnight, hoping they'd be warmed into truth. Charming, unverifiable, very on brand for the period. And then once the embers were banked, shutters barred, candles snuffed, bed called. Not always a bed, really. A blanket in the loft, a sheepskin on the floor, a shared mattress on ropes. But the act of lying down was sacred. You'd say a prayer. Cross yourself. Roll to your left if superstition struck you. Face the wall. face the fire, face someone snoring. You'd pull the blanket up to your chin, tug your hood down over your ears, and breathe slowly. And even with the bugs, the noise, the cold, and the hard edges, you'd begin to drift, because the day had finally given you permission to rest. And in a world without glowing rectangles, buzzing alerts, or 24/7 urgency, that permission was everything. Night falls again, and you're already sensing the shift, not just in the light, but in the behavior of the house. People move more quietly. The fire gets prodded one last time. Voices drop into murmurs, as if not to wake something ancient sleeping just outside the door. It's nearly time to bed down. But first you have to consider where. Because unless you're nobility, odds are you don't have a room of your own. You don't even have a bed of your own. You share it with someone, maybe several someones. Family, children, apprentices, guests, cousins who stayed too long after supper. The medieval bed was a communal affair, less a place of private retreat and more a snug, shared human sandwich. In fact, bed sharing wasn't just common, it was expected. Travelers bunked together in inns. Servants slept near their masters. Strangers sometimes paired up to save on lodging fees. It was economical, yes, but also, to be honest, warm. In the absence of central heating and electric blankets, your best bet was another person's body heat. The more, the merrier. The squishier, the toastier. If you're picturing a medieval sleepover every night, you're not far off. Some households had what were called truckle beds, small wheeled frames that could roll out from under a larger bed. Servants or children might sleep there, tucked beneath the master's bed like a drawer of dreams. Others simply laid down pallets of straw near the hearth or bundled themselves on benches, cloaked against the chill. But the shared bed was the center of it all, and it came with some complications. Imagine the choreography. Everyone has their own bedtime fidgets. Someone hogs the blanket, someone else has cold feet, children squirm, adults snore, a goat sneezes in the next room. No one is more than a few feet from anyone else. In some cases, people even slept top to tail, meaning alternating head and foot direction, especially if beds were narrow. A very practical solution if you didn't mind the occasional toe to the nose. There were, of course, rules. You didn't speak loudly once under the covers. You didn't stare at someone while they were falling asleep. Extremely bad form. You didn't thrash about or sneak an extra pillow. And if you were sleeping beside a superior, like an employer or an elder, you kept to your side and stayed still like a human-shaped bookshelf. Historians still argue how common mixed-gender bed sharing really was. In families, certainly. Mothers with children, husbands with wives. But among adults, it could get complicated. In inns, two male travelers might share a bed without a second thought. But a man and woman sharing a bed while unmarried? That raised eyebrows, unless it was strictly business, like midwives or caretakers. And even then, tongues wagged. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the closeness, sharing a bed wasn't necessarily intimate. People developed mental filters. You ignored the snoring, the fidgeting, the odd dream mumble. You pretended not to hear whispered conversations. In many ways, it was like sleeping on a long-distance bus, everyone awkwardly unified by shared discomfort and the basic human need to not freeze. Still, some stories hint at the comedic side of this arrangement. One 14th century tale tells of a traveling priest who spent the night in a village home and found himself tucked between a blacksmith and a very chatty grandmother. He didn't sleep a wink. The grandmother snored like a cow in labor. The blacksmith sleep-talked about pigs. The priest fled at dawn, vowing celibacy with new conviction. Quirkier still, some beds came with bed companions, not people but objects. A hot stone wrapped in cloth, a sack of grain warmed near the fire, even a carved wooden bed bolster shaped like a person, used to simulate shared sleep for comfort or perhaps a sense of modesty. It's one of those things historians find in records, squint at and say, maybe, probably, we'll never know. But tonight, you roll into your usual place on the mattress, sandwiched between someone who hums when they sleep and someone who drools. The blanket's thin. The bed ropes creak like an old door hinge. But the warmth, immediate. The sense of shared survival, real. You close your eyes and listen. To the sighs, the soft scratch of someone adjusting their cap. The quiet, uneven rhythm of bodies surrendering to sleep. No earbuds, no white noise machines, just the small, imperfect harmony of humans curled up together, breathing in sync. Not so private, not so spacious, but deeply human. Your eyes flutter open for a moment, unsure whether it's still night or early dawn. But it doesn't matter, because someone nearby is snoring again, louder this time, with a rhythmic woof-woof snort that could wake the dead if the dead hadn't already gotten used to it. You shift slightly on the mattress, careful not to disturb anyone. A child mumbles in their sleep. The blanket slips a bit, and a chill tickles your ankle. Still, you don't get up. This is intersleep, the medieval twilight zone between first and second sleep, and it's surprisingly peaceful. Let's talk about that, the two-sleep system. For medieval people, a good night's sleep didn't mean a solid 8 hours. Instead, the night was commonly broken into two distinct segments, first sleep and second sleep. You'd go to bed not long after sunset, wake up naturally a few hours later, spend time awake, then fall asleep again until dawn. It wasn't insomnia, it was just normal. That middle of the night interval, it might last anywhere from 30 minutes to a couple of hours. People used it for prayer, quiet conversation, checking the fire, light chores, or even just lying still and letting their minds wander. In wealthier homes, it was sometimes a time for intimacy, because apparently nothing says romance like half-asleep candlelit small talk, while someone nearby mutters in their dreams. Some even use this period for reflection. There are records of people getting up to read devotional texts or recite verses. In monasteries, nighttime prayers, vigils were timed perfectly to coincide with this natural wakefulness. The church, it seems, approved of segmented sleep long before sleep scientists rediscovered it centuries later. Historians still argue whether the two-sleep pattern was biologically driven or culturally conditioned. Was it an inevitable result of the lack of artificial lighting, or something passed down through social norms and expectations? There's evidence that once gas lamps and electricity came along, people gradually stopped waking up in the middle of the night, almost as if that quiet interlude had never existed. But in your candlelit world, it feels natural. You lie there in the dimness, staring at a knot in the wooden ceiling. The coals in the hearth still glow faintly. Somewhere outside, a dog barks once, then falls silent. Inside, the hush is deeper than quiet. It's dense, wrapped in wool and flickering shadows. A few fringe beliefs surrounded this middle-of-the-night hour. In parts of Ireland, it was said that dreams dreamt between first and second sleep were truer, more potent. In Sicily, midwives whispered that babies conceived during that window were more likely to be born under lucky stars. Superstition? Absolutely. But in a world without clocks or sleep apps, people took their omens where they could get them. Not everyone stayed in bed either. Farmers sometimes used the break to check on livestock. City dwellers might stoke their hearths or warm leftover pottage. In winter, someone might rise to throw a new log on the fire, then sit watching it for a while, not quite asleep, not quite awake. And then, just like that, it's over. Your body begins to pull you downward again. Your limbs grow heavier. The snoring fades into the background like a lullaby you've heard 1,000 times. Second sleep begins, and this one is deeper, less troubled. Your body's already relaxed. You've adjusted to the cold, the strange breathing rhythms around you, the occasional bump from a shifting bedmate. You're no longer listening for noises or tracking the shape of shadows. You've surrendered. There's something comforting in knowing you'll wake again, but not yet. Now it's just the hush and warmth, and the soft creak of the ropes as the mattress shifts with a sleepy sigh. You wake with a soft start, unsure whether it was a dream or the goose honking outside the window that pulled you back to consciousness. Either way, second sleep has ended, and the gray light of dawn is bleeding through the wooden shutters. The room smells like warm wool and cold breath. You exhale and watch the cloud of mist curl upward. Yep, still freezing. Someone stirs beside you, grumbling into their blanket. A child coughs, and from the far corner there's the distinct, unmistakable sound of someone stepping into a wooden shoe. A new day begins. But before you toss aside the blankets and brace yourself for morning chores, let's pause a moment longer and talk about dreams. Because in the medieval world, sleep wasn't just rest. It was a portal. You see, dreams were important. More than just the brain sorting through odd memories and leftover emotions, dreams were messages, warnings, sometimes prophecies, sometimes divine whispers or devilish tricks. You never quite knew which. For people in the Middle Ages, dreams often came with serious meaning. You might wake in a cold sweat, convinced that the strange man with the fish head and flaming sword you saw in your dream was Saint Michael. Or perhaps your grandmother warning you not to eat the pottage again. And if you were someone of note, a noble, a bishop, a merchant with political influence, you might even summon someone to interpret your dream, especially if it involved snakes, ravens, or ominous weather. Books of dream interpretation circulated through monasteries and courts alike. Some were elaborate manuals filled with helpful translations. Dream of bees? Wealth is coming. Dream of falling into water? You're about to lie. Dream of onions? Probably means nothing or everything. People went to sleep with the hope that dreams might offer answers, or at least a break from the realities of day-to-day struggle. Dreams were sometimes the only place you could escape hunger, sickness, or your neighbor's awful lute playing. Of course, not every dream was serious. There are records of medieval folk writing down their more ridiculous nocturnal adventures. One 13th century monk recorded a dream where a chicken sang the Psalms in Latin while baking a pie. He made a note of it in the margin, adding, "A sign of nothing except indigestion." And then there were dreams used as evidence. In court, believe it or not, people occasionally referenced dreams as part of legal testimony. I dreamed my neighbor stole my cow, and then it turned up missing. Not exactly airtight logic, but in a society that prized divine intervention, dreams were sometimes taken very seriously, especially if they aligned with pre-existing suspicions, or if the cow had a track record. Even kings consulted their dreams. Richard II was famously obsessed with a recurring dream of falling into water, which he believed foretold betrayal. And Joan of Arc, well, her dreams and visions didn't just change her life, they changed history. Sleep, it seems, wasn't just a time for rest, it was a realm of messages that could steer your fate. Historians still debate how common these beliefs really were among ordinary folk. Did your average Thatcher believe his dream about talking sheep meant anything? Or was that just what happened when you ate too much moldy cheese before bed? It's hard to say, but the records are clear. Dreams mattered. They were talked about, shared, and sometimes even feared. And that fear, it wasn't just about bad omens. People worried about what they did in their dreams. If you committed a sin in your sleep, especially if it felt real, you might wake up and immediately go confess it, just in case. Because in the medieval mind, sin wasn't always about intention. Sometimes it was about effect. There's even a charming, if slightly unsettling account of a nun who dreamed she accidentally married the devil. She spent 3 days in penance and fasting afterward, just to make sure the celestial paperwork got canceled. You, however, probably just dreamed of bread, or riding a horse made of clouds, or chasing a goose who owed you money. Dreams, like people, were unpredictable, but in this candlelit world, they were one of the few places you could be completely free, flying, fighting, weeping, laughing, and sometimes waking up with a puzzled grin. And now, as dawn truly settles in, you feel that last dreamy fog lifting. You stretch once, long and slow, and the real world rushes back. Cold air, creaking ropes, rustling blankets, and the soft clatter of a spoon in a pot from the next room. Time to rise. But maybe, just maybe, you'll remember that dream a little longer. You've finally wriggled out of the warmth and taken your first brave steps across the chill floor. A few others are awake now too, sitting up, stretching, fumbling with belts and laces. One child is still face down in a wool blanket, determined to ignore the world for at least another 10 minutes. Honestly, you respect it. But let's turn your thoughts towards something far more comforting than a shared mattress or a questionable dream. Let's talk about bedtime snacks. Because yes, despite what you might assume about gritty medieval survival, people absolutely enjoyed a little something before bed. Whether to stave off nighttime hunger, warm the belly, or calm the nerves, the evening bite was a small but treasured part of winding down. For poorer households, this often meant warm ale or a weak pottage. You might heat up a bit of yesterday's stew, thinned with water and thickened again with barley or rye. Add a hunk of bread, not fresh, mind you, but softened in the broth, and you had a makeshift supper that stuck to your ribs just enough to help you drift off. In colder regions, people favored something hot and milky. Goat milk, if you were lucky, sometimes heated with a bit of honey or even a splash of ale for those with nervous constitutions. No chamomile tea here, just warmth, calories, and a vague hope that it wouldn't turn in your stomach by morning. The wealthy, of course, had more extravagant options. A small bowl of sweetened rice with almond milk, spiced with cinnamon if it could be spared. Leftover meat pies eaten cold or warmed near the fire. Roasted apples with cloves. Even candied fennel or sugared aniseed considered comforting to the digestion. Because what's bedtime without a tiny sprinkle of medieval luxury? One curious favorite, especially in Northern Europe, was sops. Not the most glamorous word, but oddly satisfying. Sops were slices of stale bread soaked in warm wine or broth. They could be savory or sweet depending on what you had on hand. Richer households added egg yolks, honey, or saffron. Poorer families just soaked the bread long enough to make it chewable. And yes, this was considered perfectly normal for children and adults alike. Historians still argue how consistent evening meals really were across regions. Some claim most people ate just 2 meals a day, a late morning meal and an early supper. Others insist that light bedtime food, especially in winter months, was more common than previously thought. It likely depended on class, climate, and the amount of firewood you could spare. And speaking of firewood, many bedtime snacks doubled as hand warmers. A bowl of hot pottage clutched in both hands while you sat near the embers, that was more than food, it was heating. Especially in homes without chimneys, where smoke lingered low and everything stayed just a little damp. A hot meal was your closest thing to a thermal blanket. For children, bedtime might include a cup of warmed ale thinned with water. Yes, even for the little ones, or a bit of bread soaked in milk if you were very lucky. Not the kind of snack a modern pediatrician would endorse, but it worked for the times. It quieted bellies and softened the transition into sleep. In some households, bedtime food wasn't just about hunger, it was about habit, a ritual, something to mark the day's end. And as with all rituals, it came with stories. One old tale tells of a baker's apprentice who insisted on nibbling the crusts of burnt loaves each night before bed. He said they kept nightmares away. Another speaks of a widow who brewed a special tea of fennel and dried rose petals to sip before sleep. Locals whispered that her dreams were so vivid she once predicted a neighbor's harvest. More likely, the tea just helped her relax. Quirkier still, a fringe practice found in some remote English villages involved hanging garlic-stuffed rolls near the bedpost. Not to eat, just to smell. It was believed that the scent would chase away night walkers or bad spirits. And yes, this meant you went to sleep in a room that smelled faintly like a tavern kitchen. But if it worked, who's complaining? You now settle near the hearth, sipping something warm, maybe soaking that last crust in broth. The room flickers in candlelight. Someone nearby hums a half-forgotten tune. Your eyelids droop. And just like that, the simple comfort of a bedtime snack becomes more than food. It becomes part of the slow, rhythmic descent into rest, a signal to your body and your world that the day is done. You're back in bed now, the warmth returning to your limbs like honey poured over chilled stone. The blanket's rough but familiar. Someone near the hearth is snuffing out the last candle, the room folding slowly into darkness. But your mind, restless as always, is still whirring. And it lands quite reasonably on a question. How did people fall asleep in a world so full of noise? Because here's the thing, medieval nights weren't silent. Not really. Sure, there were no traffic jams, no neon signs buzzing, no delivery trucks groaning down the street, but that doesn't mean peace and quiet. In fact, the medieval soundscape was surprisingly rich and occasionally ridiculous. Let's begin with the livestock. If you lived in a rural home, or even in a smaller village, animals weren't just in the barn, they were often in the house. Chickens under benches, goats in lean-tos pressed against the outer wall, a cow lowing softly from the other side of a shared wall, or worse, a pig snorting in its sleep directly beneath your loft. And they didn't care about your bedtime. Dogs barked at shadows, roosters occasionally misfired at 2 a.m., a restless goat might knock over a bucket, sending everyone jerking upright with a start. One noblewoman's household records even mention a prized falcon that snored, loudly. In urban settings, it wasn't much better. Townhouses were packed together, often sharing walls so thin you could hear your neighbor sneeze. Night watchmen roamed the streets, calling the hour, and sometimes also alerting everyone to fires, brawls, or just how cold it was. 3 of the clock and all is well, except my toes. Then there were drunks, always a few, lurching home from taverns, singing ballads with only half the lyrics remembered. And don't forget the cats. Cats fighting in alleys was practically medieval white noise, yet somehow, people slept. How? Partly out of exhaustion. Daily life was physical. You didn't scroll for 6 hours under a blanket. You hauled water, scrubbed linen, walked miles, lifted stones, stirred heavy pots. By evening, your body wanted to shut down. But also, people got used to it. The same way you might tune out the hum of an air conditioner or the faint beeping of a fridge, medieval sleepers learned to sleep through goat burps and muffled neighbor arguments. In wealthier homes, there were tricks. Tapestries on the walls absorbed noise, an early form of acoustic paneling. Thick bed curtains muffled outside sounds. Servants sometimes padded across floors on rush mats to keep things quieter, and some families developed nighttime rituals specifically to wind down the noise, humming lullabies, whispering prayers, using soft footfall and gestures instead of loud commands. Historians still argue whether people were more tolerant of noise or just had no other choice. There's evidence of complaints, even legal action, against unseasonable noise. One 15th century weaver in Bruges filed a grievance because his neighbor's geese honked too loudly at night. The ruling? The geese were divinely created and therefore exempt. Tough luck, sleepyhead. But for every complaint, there's also affection. A record from a Yorkshire abbey includes a monk's note about the gentle chatter of mice behind the hearth as he fell asleep. It's oddly poetic, almost cozy. Then, there were ambient sounds that helped people sleep. The crackle of a dying fire, the slow creak of wood beams settling, the gentle rustle of wind against a thatched roof, the breathing of others in the room, steady, rhythmic, strangely reassuring. In some homes, the sound of a spinning wheel slowing down for the night became a kind of lullaby in itself. And let's not forget, you had no frame of reference for silence. True silence, the vacuum-tight kind we imagine in modern quiet retreats, didn't exist. Every village, every home had its own symphony. Sleep simply meant accepting it, living with it, letting it become background music to your nightly departure from the waking world. You curl up tighter now, the familiar sounds all around you, the wheeze of someone's breath, the creak of the bedpost as your neighbor turns. Outside, maybe a sheep bleats once, then stops. Inside, everything softens. No earbuds. No ambient rain tracks. Just a night full of real, living noise, embraced, endured, and ultimately, soothing. You're still nestled under the blanket, the straw-stuffed mattress adapting awkwardly to your shape, offering just enough support to keep your hip from falling asleep before the rest of you. Your eyes are nearly closed now, lulled by the rise and fall of breath around you. But before you drift off completely, let's follow your thoughts down one last path for the night. You wonder, what if you get sick during the night? Because, of course, not every night in the medieval world ended in peaceful slumber. Some ended in shivers, in whispered prayers, or in the sudden urge to find the nearest chamber pot. Let's talk about what happened when bedtime met illness. You see, the medieval bed was more than just a place to sleep. It was a sick bed, a deathbed, a convalescent sanctuary, and often the only place of privacy available. The phrase "take to one's bed" wasn't just poetic, it was medical advice. When unwell, you stayed in bed, because that was the only treatment most people had. You didn't power through a cold. You wrapped yourself in your blanket, kept close to the fire, and drank something warm and slightly questionable. If your illness was mild, a fever, a cough, a bout of melancholia, you were simply left to rest. Warm ale might be offered, spiced with herbs like sage or thyme. A hot compress might be applied if someone in the house knew what they were doing. And occasionally, someone would mutter over your bed with a charm or blessing just to cover all the bases. But if things took a turn, the bed became a theater of worry. Others might be called in to pray over you. A family member might sit by your side, pressing a damp cloth to your forehead, or offering honeyed wine if you could keep it down. In monasteries and large manors, beds designated for the sick were drawn close to the fire. Curtains closed tightly. Floors were strewn with fresh rushes soaked in vinegar, thought to purify the air. And of course, there were bedside superstitions. Some believed a bed should never face north, or that turning a sick bed to face the sunrise might invite recovery. Others swore by the placement of specific herbs beneath the mattress: sage for strength, lavender for calm, or St. John's wort to keep away demons. One fringe tradition even recommended tying a small bag of crumbled communion wafer to the bedpost to ward off death itself. Unofficial theology, but desperate times. Historians still argue how effective these rituals were, or whether they were more about psychological comfort than physical cure. Probably both. Because in the absence of antibiotics or coherent germ theory, people reached for what they could control: light, warmth, words, and rhythm. Interestingly, some of the earliest recorded hospital beds were not in clinics, but in churches and monasteries. Nuns and monks would tend to the sick, often with astounding patience. Records from a 12th century abbey in Burgundy describe a practice of singing psalms softly near the head of a sleeping patient. Not as treatment, exactly, more as reassurance, a kind of sonic blanket. But back in your shared household, nursing duties were usually done by family. Your grandmother might stay up, poking the fire back to life, adding another layer of wool to your chest. A neighbor might come with a poultice, or offer a tincture brewed from herbs and vinegar. You might even be visited by the local wise woman who'd smell faintly of onions and fennel and give you a terrifyingly vague diagnosis: something's wrong in your humors. And then there were the night watchers. These were the people who stayed up with the gravelly ill, often through the darkest hours, sitting in a chair beside the bed, candle flickering beside them, whispering prayers or simply watching for signs of improvement or not. If the illness was serious enough, it was considered dangerous to leave someone alone through the night, as if the very silence of midnight could be coaxed into stealing a soul. And what of death itself? Well, it came often in the Middle Ages, but death at night was seen as strangely dignified, peaceful. If someone passed during sleep, it was said that angels had come softly, walking on rush-strewn floors to carry the soul away. In wealthier homes, a priest might be called to offer last rites. The dying person would grip a crucifix or have one tied to their chest with twine if they could no longer hold it. In simpler homes, family would gather, whisper final words, and offer a hand to hold. The bed, so often a place of rest, became a passage, quiet, sacred, final. But you're not dying tonight, just a sniffle maybe, or a bit of heartburn from that slightly too old sop soaked in questionable wine. You pull the blanket higher, someone coughs once and turns. You close your eyes, you're alive, warm, and surrounded by the sounds of a house at rest. Whatever the ailment, this bed will hold you through it. The bed creaks as someone stirs, a murmur ripples through the dark, someone whispering about the fire dying too low, but you're not moving, you're warm. Wrapped like a very tired burrito in layers of wool and linen. So instead, your thoughts drift lazily towards something you haven't quite pondered before. What about sleepwear? Because surely, medieval people didn't just hop into bed in full hose and tunic. Or did they? Let's tug at that thread for a bit. First, the obvious. If you were poor, and many were, your sleepwear was whatever you had on already. No special pajamas, no soft lounge robes, just your regular day clothes, loosened at the belt and collar, maybe unbuttoned or unlaced in strategic places. That same tunic you wore to muck the pigpen, now it's your nightgown too, cozy. You might remove your outer layers if it wasn't too cold, but underclothes often stayed on. Because in homes where the wind made itself known between the roof slats, stripping down was inadvisable. Still, for those who could afford it, medieval sleepwear did exist. Long, loose nightshirts made of linen, soft and worn thin over time, were common among the middle and upper classes. They reached to the knees or ankles, depending on personal preference and modesty level. Men and women alike wore them, often indistinguishable from one another, one less thing to argue about. In wealthier households, these nightshirts could even be embroidered. Not elaborately, of course, just enough to say, yes, I dream in style. Some had decorative cuffs or a bit of colored stitching at the collar, a tiny luxury for an otherwise simple garment. There are mentions of nightcaps, too, soft cloth caps tied under the chin to retain heat. No one wanted to catch a chill from the night air sneaking in under the thatch. And yes, these looked exactly as silly as you imagine. But practicality beat fashion after dark. Some wore socks to bed, others wrapped their feet in cloth. And for extra chilly nights, a woolen cloak might be pulled over the entire bed, like a big, sleepy burrito blanket shared by everyone under it. Blanket is a generous word, by the way. Often, it was just a rough woolen length that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to be a cloak, a rug, or a horse blanket. Multifunctional, if a bit itchy. Historians still argue whether dedicated sleepwear was widespread before the late medieval period. Some sources suggest it was mostly a luxury of clergy and the nobility, those who could afford clothes just for sleeping. Others claim even modest townsfolk had at least one designated linen nightshirt, especially as trade grew and fabric became slightly more accessible. In monasteries, sleep attire was a hot topic, surprisingly. Some rules required monks to sleep in their habits, others insisted on a plain linen tunic for bed to avoid vanity. The Cistercians, ever the minimalists, preferred minimal comfort. Mortify the flesh by freezing it was not an actual quote, but honestly, not far off. And then there's one of history's most amusing side notes, the bedrobe. A kind of early dressing gown worn by nobles and merchants while lounging in bed awake. Yes, medieval people lounged, especially if they were important. Picture this, a merchant lord reclining on a cushioned bed, dictating letters to a scribe, sipping spiced wine, wearing a velvet robe with fur trim. It's not exactly a Netflix binge, but it gets the job done. These robes weren't meant for sleep, but for what we might call pre-bed when-down. You'd slip it on after supper, wear it while warming your feet by the fire, or gossiping with your spouse about how the neighbor's goats got loose again. Fringe fashion aside, most sleepwear served one key function, temperature control. You were trying to trap heat, keep limbs covered, and maybe, just maybe, avoid waking up with a spider investigating your armpit. Quirky footnote? There's a 14th century account of a nobleman who had separate sleepwear for summer and winter, one made of linen, the other of fine wool, both kept in a cedar chest to protect them from moths. He was known to boast that he sweated not a drop in July, nor shivered come January. This, apparently, was his legacy. You, on the other hand, are content with your single linen shift, slightly scratchy but familiar. Your feet are tucked in, your head is warm under its cap, you're layered like a lasagna of medieval coziness, and despite the noise, the creaking, the sharing, and the draft sneaking under the door, you're nearly asleep again. Because the clothes don't make the sleeper, but they do make the sleep slightly less chilly. The fire's just a dull glow now, barely illuminating the curve of the kettle and the sleepy slump of someone's shoulder across the room. You're wrapped snug and your mind rather stubbornly continues to wander. You're thinking now, not of what you wear to bed, but what others once wore around your bed. Let's pull back the bed curtains, yes, the literal ones, and talk about bedchambers. Because while most medieval people didn't even have a room in the modern sense, for those who did, the bedchamber was more than a place to sleep. It was a social stage, a political backdrop, a private meeting room, and quite often, a very public performance space for sleeping. Let's start simple. If you were a commoner, your bedroom was the only room. One open space shared with family, animals, visitors, and probably a fair number of spiders. You'd sleep by the fire, or up in the loft if you were lucky. Privacy, not a thing. Walls, rare. Doors that closed, optional, and they squeaked. But for the wealthier folks, nobles, merchants, and the church elite, bedchambers were very much a thing. In castles, they were known as solars, upper floor rooms where the lord or lady could escape the noise of the hall and have some semblance of privacy. But not too much. People still came and went. You'd entertain guests there, hold meetings, dictate letters, even receive visitors while sitting up in bed, fully dressed, surrounded by cushions and possibly a small audience of attendants. That wasn't seen as odd. In fact, it was a sign of status, because if you didn't have to leave your bed to run your estate, why would you? One French noblewoman reportedly held a full council meeting from bed during a bout of gout, attended by scribes, lawyers, and one very nervous goat who wandered in by mistake. Efficiency at its finest. And these bed chambers were not modest affairs. They were often lined with tapestries to keep out the cold and to show off wealth. The bed itself might be carved from oak, inlaid with motifs of lions, saints, or, if you were feeling whimsical, dancing rabbits. The mattress stuffed with feathers, the pillows embroidered, the canopy heavy enough to stop an arrow. Maybe. Historians still debate that one. Bed curtains served multiple purposes. They kept warmth in, blocked drafts, and most importantly, gave you a sense of privacy in a very communal world. You draw them closed not just to sleep, but to pray, to weep, to change clothes, or to not hear your cousin discussing pig prices for the 10th time that week. Some noble households even had a separate bed tester, a kind of inspector whose job was to check the bed's cleanliness, structure, and comfort before the lord or lady turned in. This, of course, became an actual job title. Imagine introducing yourself as the Baroness's official mattress evaluator. But in monastic communities, things were a little different. Sleeping quarters were sparse, uniform, and often communal, lined up like shoeboxes of ascetic dreams. Privacy was discouraged. You slept in silence, sometimes on straw mats, wearing your habit, probably dreaming of bread. And yet, even here, each monk's space was respected, quietly and without question. A lesson in boundaries before they were fashionable. Historians still argue about how much time people actually spent in their bedchambers. Some say it was minimal, just for sleep and the occasional moping session. Others suggest they were multifunctional hubs, especially for women who were often confined to domestic spaces. Letters, sewing, storytelling, even teaching lessons all happened within those curtained walls. And let's not ignore the drama, because when everything happens around the bed, everything can happen around the bed. Jealousies, inheritance secrets, marriage negotiations, and occasionally ghost stories. Yes, the medieval bedchamber was haunted territory. Many believed that spirits were especially active at night, particularly near the hearth or the bed's footboard. One 15th century text warns against sleeping with your feet pointing toward the door, lest the soul slip out uninvited. There were even rituals for purifying bedchambers, burning juniper, sprinkling holy water in the corners, hanging protective charms over the lintel. One particularly creative superstition involved tucking a small iron nail under the bedpost to pin evil dreams in place. Whether it worked or not is up for debate, but at least it kept the furniture from wobbling. Quirky bonus fact, in some royal courts, there were designated witnesses to a couple's wedding night. Not in the room, thankfully, but close enough to verify that yes, the marriage had been consummated, and that the sheets could be presented as evidence. A thoroughly sleep-ruining tradition, if ever there was one. But tonight, you're not nobility. No audience, no advisors, just you, your blanket, a curtain if you're lucky, and the muffled shuffle of someone heading to the chamber pot. And you're grateful for the quiet, because even if your bedchamber is no bigger than a cupboard, it's yours for the night. The fire has died down, the whispers have stopped, and your little corner of the world is still. The fire's just a dull glow now, barely illuminating the curve of the kettle and the sleepy slump of someone's shoulder across the room. You're wrapped snug and your mind, rather stubbornly, continues to wander. You're thinking now, not of what you wear to bed, but what others once wore around your bed. Let's pull back the bed curtains, yes, the literal ones, and talk about bedchambers. Because while most medieval people didn't even have a room in the modern sense, for those who did, the bedchamber was more than a place to sleep. It was a social stage, a political backdrop, a private meeting room, and, quite often, a very public performance space for sleeping. Let's start simple. If you were a commoner, your bedroom was the only room. One open space, shared with family, animals, visitors, and probably a fair number of spiders. You'd sleep by the fire or up in the loft if you were lucky. Privacy? Not a thing. Walls? Rare. Doors that closed? Optional, and they squeaked. But for the wealthier folks, nobles, merchants, and the church elite, bedchambers were very much a thing. In castles, they were known as solars. Upper floor rooms where the lord or lady could escape the noise of the hall and have some semblance of privacy. But not too much. People still came and went. You'd entertain guests there, hold meetings, dictate letters, even receive visitors while sitting up in bed, fully dressed, surrounded by cushions and possibly a small audience of attendants. That wasn't seen as odd. In fact, it was a sign of status. Because if you didn't have to leave your bed to run your estate, why would you? One French noblewoman reportedly held a full council meeting from bed during a bout of gout, attended by scribes, lawyers, and one very nervous goat who wandered in by mistake. Efficiency at its finest. And these bedchambers were not modest affairs. They were often lined with tapestries to keep out the cold and to show off wealth. The bed itself might be carved from oak, inlaid with motifs of lions, saints, Or, if you were feeling whimsical, dancing rabbits. The mattress stuffed with feathers, the pillows embroidered, the canopy heavy enough to stop an arrow. Maybe. Historians still debate that one. Bed curtains served multiple purposes. They kept warmth in, blocked drafts, and most importantly, gave you a sense of privacy in a very communal world. You'd draw them closed, not just to sleep, but to pray, to weep, to change clothes, or to not hear your cousin discussing pig prices for the 10th time that week. Some noble households even had a separate bed tester, a kind of inspector whose job was to check the bed's cleanliness, structure, and comfort before the lord or lady turned in. This, of course, became an actual job title. Imagine introducing yourself as the Baroness's official mattress evaluator. But in monastic communities, things were a little different. Sleeping quarters were sparse, uniform, and often communal, lined up like shoeboxes of ascetic dreams. Privacy was discouraged. You slept in silence, sometimes on straw mats, wearing your habit, probably dreaming of bread. And yet, even here, each monk's space was respected, quietly and without question. A lesson in boundaries before they were fashionable. Historians still argue about how much time people actually spent in their bedchambers. Some say it was minimal, just for sleep and the occasional moping session. Others suggest they were multifunctional hubs, especially for women, who were often confined to domestic spaces. Letters, sewing, storytelling, even teaching lessons all happened within those curtained walls. And let's not ignore the drama. Because when everything happens around the bed, everything can happen around the bed. Jealousies, inheritance secrets, marriage negotiations, and occasionally ghost stories. Yes, the medieval bedchamber was haunted territory. Many believed that spirits were especially active at night, particularly near the hearth or the bed's footboard. One 15th century text warns against sleeping with your feet pointing toward the door, lest the soul slip out uninvited. There were even rituals for purifying bedchambers, burning juniper, sprinkling holy water in the corners, hanging protective charms over the lintel. One particularly creative superstition involved tucking a small iron nail under the bedpost to pin evil dreams in place. Whether it worked or not is up for debate, but at least it kept the furniture from wobbling. Quirky bonus fact, in some royal courts there were designated witnesses to a couple's wedding night. Not in the room, thankfully, but close enough to verify that yes, the marriage had been consummated and that the sheets could be presented as evidence. A thoroughly sleep-ruining tradition, if ever there was one. But tonight, you're not nobility. No audience, no advisors, just you, your blanket, a curtain, if you're lucky, and the muffled shuffle of someone heading to the chamber pot. And you're grateful for the quiet. Because even if your bedchamber is no bigger than a cupboard, it's yours for the night. The fire has died down, the whispers have stopped, and your little corner of the world is still. By now, the coals are almost out, just a soft crimson pulse under the ash. The room has quieted into that deepest part of night, when time feels suspended, when even the snores take on a rhythm like breathing earth. You're still wrapped tightly in the same warmth, and your thoughts drift towards something gentler. Rituals. Because medieval bedtime wasn't just collapsing into sleep. For many, it was a quiet ceremony of its own, a carefully built ladder into the dark, rung by rung. Let's start with prayer. Even the humblest homes tended to end the day with some kind of spiritual murmur. A whispered Pater Noster or Ave Maria, the syllables soft as breath, often spoken in Latin even if the speaker didn't understand each word. It wasn't about grammar, it was about rhythm, repetition, comfort, like a familiar song at the edge of your consciousness. Families often prayed together, kneeling beside the bed on a rush mat or the packed earth floor lit only by a stub of candle. Sometimes holding hands, sometimes with heads bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the bedding. Thankfulness for surviving another day, pleas for rest, protection against nightmares, theft, sudden illness, and of course, temptations of the flesh, which medieval folks loved to worry about. You might also recite a local charm or blessing. God keep me through the night and wake me with the light. Or something more regional and specific. May the Virgin guard my dreams and St. Michael stand by my door. These little phrases passed from grandmother to child, neighbor to neighbor, until they became more habit than hope. And yet, they lingered. Monastic communities, of course, had bedtime rituals written into stone. The final prayers of Compline, sung in echoing Latin under flickering torches, marked the boundary between waking and rest. Once spoken, silence began, strict and total. No chatter, no footsteps, not even a cough, if you could help it. Back in the village, bedtime might also include a brief check of the home. Doors bolted, coals banked with ash, a jug of water left near the bed, partly to drink, partly to throw at unexpected fires, and partly to ward off restless spirits. You'd pat the bed to make sure no bugs had claimed a corner. Check the corners of the room for shadows that didn't belong. And sometimes you told stories. Not the grand epics of knights and dragons. Those were for feast days and public squares. At bedtime, the stories were smaller, cozier. A tale about a fox that tricked a greedy priest. A ghost who got distracted and forgot to haunt. A dream about a talking goat who predicted the weather with remarkable accuracy. Children loved these tales, of course, but adults listened too, pretending not to. Because the stories weren't just entertaining, they were calming. They flattened the day's worries into something gentler, more distant, more absurd. Quirkier still were sleep position superstitions. Some swore it was dangerous to sleep on your back, that it made you vulnerable to spirits. Others said sleeping on your left side would give you nightmares because that's where the devil whispered. A few believed the only truly safe way to sleep was curled tightly on your right, hand over heart facing the wall. If nothing else, it kept you from being breathed on by your snoring brother. Historians still debate whether these rituals were acts of faith or just deeply practical traditions that survived because they made people feel less alone. The answer is probably both. A whispered prayer may not chase away illness, but it steadies the breath. A bedtime story doesn't ward off danger, but it softens the dark. And these rituals evolved with the seasons. In winter, you might wrap your prayer stone, yes, that was a thing, in a warm cloth and hold it in bed. In summer, you'd sleep with your nightshirt unbelted and the window slit propped slightly open, hoping for a breeze that didn't carry mosquitoes or gossip. The rituals might shift with age too. Children were given charms, tiny bags with bits of wool or poppy seeds to help them sleep. Older folks mumbled psalms, rubbed aching joints with goose grease, and whispered the names of those long gone as they drifted off. One 14th century midwife wrote that she always ended her day by rubbing lavender between her palms, then pressing them gently to her cheeks before sleep. "So my face smells like fields, not ashes," she said. That image has stayed with us somehow. One woman choosing to carry the scent of summer into her dreams. You tonight follow your own version of this sacred pattern. Your limbs are still, your thoughts slower. Maybe you whispered something just now. A phrase half remembered, passed to you from a face you no longer see. Maybe it's enough. Maybe it always was. The dark wraps around you like velvet, and the fire gives one last sigh. The day has ended not with thunder or triumph, but with breath, habit, and hush. And now, with the hush settled deep and your breathing slow, you begin to notice something curious. You're awake again. Just a little. Not fully. That twilight place between sleep and rising, where dreams still cling, but the edges of thought return. You wouldn't be alone in this, because medieval people didn't necessarily sleep the way we do today. In fact, they often slept in two parts. Let's talk about the mysterious rhythm of segmented sleep. This wasn't an oddity. It was normal. So normal, it didn't even need explanation. For centuries across Europe and beyond, sleep was commonly broken into two periods: first sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful period of 1 to 2 hours in between. You'd go to bed shortly after nightfall, say sometime between 8 and 9 p.m. in winter, curl up, fall into a deep slumber for 4 hours or so. Then you'd wake naturally, not startled or annoyed, but as if your body had just reached an intermission. This was the watch, the hourglass-shaped pause in the night. People use this time in all sorts of ways. You might stoke the fire, sip a bit of warmed ale or water, pray, meditate, even step outside to use the latrine or observe the stars. It wasn't strange, it wasn't insomnia, it was part of the sleep schedule. Some even used this period for work. We have records of monks copying manuscripts, farmers tending to calving animals, and bakers beginning their dough before 4-second sleep. For couples, married ones, of course, this quiet window between sleeps was also considered the ideal time for intimacy. Doctors of the era even recommended it, noting the body was well rested but not yet sluggish. You could also think, and many did. There are letters from the 13th century describing lucid dreams, spiritual revelations, and poetic inspiration all arising in this space between sleeps. One French poet claimed that his best verses came to him during the wake of the night, when the mind walks gently, unmoored. Honestly, that's a pretty solid slogan for a night owl. Historians still argue why this pattern was so widespread, and what caused it to disappear. Some say it was a response to long winter nights before artificial lighting. Others suggest it was simply how human sleep naturally functions without modern pressures, alarms, and electric glare. Because when researchers in the 1990s recreated medieval lighting conditions, letting participants live by candlelight and natural rhythms, people began to revert to segmented sleep without prompting. 2 sleeps, 1 peaceful middle, just like old times. But back in your medieval bed, this midnight wakefulness wasn't anxious. It was contemplative, almost sacred. Some would sit by the hearth, wrapped in a cloak, watching embers crackle like tiny stars. Others would murmur prayers too intimate for the daytime, a chance to confess, to hope, to let go. There's something about the middle of the night that makes emotions expand and soften, like bread rising under a cloth. A few might even use this time to visit neighbors. Yes, really. In villages where doors weren't locked and most people shared walls or courtyards, you might share a quiet hour of conversation with a friend who was also awake. Not loudly, just a visit, a quiet chat, maybe some stew or bread left over from supper. This wasn't considered lazy or odd. It was human and accepted. Eventually the body would begin to drowse again. Your head would dip forward, your fire would burn low. You'd return to bed, pulling the blanket high, and slip into second sleep, which was often deeper, richer, and filled with vivid dreams, the kind you might remember for days. There's something comforting in this rhythm, isn't there? That sleep doesn't have to be rigid or efficient, that there's a built-in pause for the soul to wander, for thoughts to drift, for your breath to catch up with your bones. So maybe tonight, if you wake for no reason at 2:47 a.m., you don't need to panic. You're just keeping very old time, sharing the watch hour with monks, poets, bakers, and shepherds long gone. You sit quietly in your medieval bed, not alone in the dark, but part of a long, gentle rhythm, older than alarms, older than light bulbs, older than guilt about being awake. The second sleep is waiting, and it always comes. So here you are, drifting, not quite asleep, not quite awake, held in the same stillness that medieval sleepers knew. The second sleep, soft and unhurried, draws near. But before it wraps you up completely, your mind lingers on one last curiosity. How did medieval people wake up? Because eventually, even the coziest pile of blankets, the warmest hearthside nook, or the safest straw mattress must give way to morning. And the Middle Ages, as dreamy as they could be at night, still demanded you rise, often early, often cold, and often without mercy. Let's start with the most basic reality. No alarm clocks. No digital chimes. No cheerful voices from bedside assistants saying it's time to seize the day. You relied instead on 3 main things: bells, roosters, and routine. For many, especially in towns and monastic communities, the first sound of morning was the church bell. Monasteries operated on strict schedules governed by the canonical hours, 7 set times throughout the day and night, marked by prayer. The first of these, matins or lauds, often rang well before dawn. Monks would rise in the dark, shuffle through cloisters half asleep, and begin their day with chanting and psalms. And these bells weren't just for monks. They echoed across villages and towns, waking bakers, millers, and weary shepherds, like a medieval snooze button, but one you couldn't ignore, because everyone else heard it too. If you were still in bed when the third bell rang, your neighbors knew. On farms, the natural alarm was, of course, the rooster. That classic symbol of dawn. And yes, they really did crow, sometimes at first light, sometimes earlier, sometimes just because they felt like it. Historians still argue whether roosters had a reliable internal clock or were simply enthusiastic morning people with wings. Then there was sunlight itself. Most medieval homes didn't have thick shutters or blackout curtains. Light streamed in through tiny windows or cracks in the thatch. The changing color of dawn, the pink-tinged grays and pale golds, would slowly creep over your bed, over your blanket, over the floor rushes now flattened from the night's pacing. It was a gentle wake-up call. Unless, of course, it revealed that the cat had knocked over your water jug. Again, but waking wasn't always abrupt. Some people woke slowly, naturally, especially if they had no pressing duties. A second sleep might stretch long into the morning. There are records of village folk stirring around mid-morning, especially during winter when the sun rose late and tasks like planting or milling couldn't begin until daylight fully arrived. And what happened after you woke up? Well, you didn't check your phone, but you might stretch. Yes, stretching is eternal. Crack a few joints and pull on your outer tunic. You'd fumble for your shoes or wrap cloth around your feet if shoes were too fancy for indoors. Maybe sip some cold ale or gnaw on leftover bread from yesterday. No croissants here, just bread, maybe dipped in something warm if you were lucky. In wealthier homes, someone might gently wake you. A servant, apprentice, or family member would knock on the bed frame or draw back the curtain with a quiet, "My lord," or "Mistress, the sun is climbing." One royal household even had a waking maid. Her whole job was just making sure the lady didn't sleep through her embroidery lessons. Quirky fact? Some people used alarm candles. These were special candles marked with notches at hourly intervals. As the candle burned, each mark would drop a bit of wax or a small metal ball into a bowl, making a tiny sound. When the right mark melted, ping, it was time to rise. Medieval innovation, low-tech style. Another method? Just asking someone. It was common to tell a family member or neighbor, "Wake me when the sun clears the trees," or "Give me a shout when the bell rings." It was a social system of waking, gentle, communal, built on trust. Not unlike roommates agreeing on coffee rotation, only with fewer coffee options and more chickens. And not everyone wanted to wake up early. Some records complain of servants who lingered too long in slumber or apprentices who rose not even at the call of the cock. There are even church sermons railing against slothful mornings, urging the faithful to begin their day with gratitude and action. You get the sense that even in 1382, some people were definitely hitting the medieval equivalent of snooze. Still, mornings were quieter than ours. No traffic, no electric buzz. Just the sounds of the waking world, boots on the floorboards, the clink of a pitcher, someone stirring porridge, birds testing their voices, and in the best cases, a few minutes of stillness. To lie there, eyes blinking open, listening to the hearth crackle and the village breathe. And maybe, just maybe, you'd roll over and mutter, 5 more minutes. Some things never change. Morning has finally stretched itself across the rooftops, and the bed, your humble nest of straw, wool, or if you're lucky, feathers, feels a little less warm now. It's time to rise, but not before we consider something quietly profound, the meaning of sleep itself, in a medieval world. Because beyond blankets and bells, routines and rushlights, there was a whole philosophy behind what it meant to sleep. In medieval thinking, sleep wasn't just physical rest. It was moral, it was spiritual, it was political, it was everything. Let's start with the basics. Sleep was considered essential, but also suspicious. Too much of it, people believed, led to laziness, acedia, a kind of spiritual sluggishness that monks especially were warned against. You weren't supposed to lie in bed all day. That was the devil's invitation to idleness. Even the saints got up early, the sermon said. Jesus rose before dawn. So should you. But sleep was also necessary for health. Physicians of the time wrote detailed guides on proper sleep, the best position on your right side, preferably, the ideal duration, not too much, not too little, and the foods to avoid before bed, beans, garlic, anything wet or windy. Yes, windy. One 12th century medical text even recommends sleeping with a clean conscience and light supper. No stew, no sorrow, it basically says. And yet, sleep was also dangerous, a liminal state. You weren't fully here, you weren't fully gone. Your soul was believed to hover between this world and the next. It was why prayers before sleep were so important, why charms were tied around cribs, why no one liked to die in their sleep because you couldn't confess on the way out. Still, in many ways, sleep was the great equalizer. Kings and beggars alike needed it. No amount of wealth could buy you immunity from yawning. And while beds differed wildly, some carved and curtained, others just rushes on the floor, the need to rest was universal. Historians still debate whether medieval people were better at sleep than we are. On one hand, their lives were full of physical labor and darkness. No phones, no email, no midnight online shopping. They followed the sun, trusted their fatigue, and accepted night as a natural pause. On the other hand, they lived with constant disruption. Cold, noise, shared spaces, illness, fear. For many, sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity that had to be snatched where and when you could find it. And for all its physicality, sleep was full of metaphor. Monks and mystics saw sleep as a rehearsal for death, a daily surrender. A tiny death followed, hopefully by a tiny resurrection. Each nightfall was a miniature apocalypse, and each dawn a redemption. Heavy stuff to ponder while fluffing your hay pillow. Then there were the dreams. Dreams in the medieval world were seen as messages, divine, demonic, or just emotional leftovers. People kept dream books, consulted clergy about visions, and tried to interpret whether the green goat meant you were blessed or just needed to stop drinking mead after Vespers. One noblewoman reportedly had a dream about a fish wearing a crown and changed her entire household's diet for a year. Another believed her dream of floating above the church roof meant she should donate land to the abbey. The monks agreed. Sometimes your dream wasn't even yours. People believed dreams could be sent by God, by saints, or by those skilled in certain arts. A whispered word beside your sleeping ear, a charm tucked under your pillow. A prayer laced with intent. The dream might come, or it might not, but the belief lingered. And then there was the sleep of the dead. Burial customs often reflected a kind of eternal bedtime. The body wrapped gently, the eyes closed, the limbs positioned as if resting. Sleep and death were siblings, intimately linked. You weren't dead in church records, you had gone to your rest. Tomb effigies even show knights lying peacefully, hands folded, swords sheathed, as if waiting to wake again. That idea, that death is just a longer sleep, offered strange comfort. And maybe that's why people treated bedtime with such quiet reverence, as if honoring the daily rhythm of falling and rising prepared you for the final one. But for now, you're still breathing, still wrapped up, still halfway between worlds. And in that space, maybe you understand medieval sleep a little more. Not just the mechanics of it, the straw, the snores, the second sleep, but the feeling of it, the hush, the rituals, the communal vulnerability, the trust you placed in the dark. You didn't expect sleep to be perfect. You just hoped it would come and hold you for a little while, which, if you think about it, is all we're still hoping for.